royal bloodlines that destroyed dynasties. Throughout history, the walls of royal palaces have hidden secrets darker than most would dare to imagine. Behind the glimmering jewels and golden thrones lies a disturbing pattern that affected some of the most powerful women ever born. A legacy of genetic decay passed from crown to crown, all in the name of royal bloodline purity. Today, we explore the haunting stories of history's most inbred women, victims of dynastic decisions made not for love or happiness, but for power, control, and status. These are the true consequences of centuries of incestuous marriages. Women born into privilege but cursed from birth, trapped by their lineage in a slow descent into disease, madness, and death. For centuries, royal families across Europe and beyond believed that preserving the purity of their bloodline was crucial to maintaining their divine right to rule. Marrying outsiders, especially commoners, was seen as a threat to the throne, a dilution of sacred lineage. As a result, royal houses arranged marriages between cousins, uncles and nieces, even siblings. What began as a political tool soon became a genetic time bomb. The same noble blood that was so obsessively protected began to circulate in a dangerously limited gene pool, amplifying recessive traits and paving the way for devastating physical and mental afflictions. These marriages weren't acts of love. They were transactions that traded personal well-being for political gain. And the women born of these unions often bore the heaviest price. Let us begin with one of the most infamous examples in European history, the Spanish Habsburgs. This powerful dynasty, which ruled much of Europe from the 15th to the 18th century, is perhaps the clearest example of how relentless inbreeding can lead to the slow, visible collapse of a royal family. While Charles II of Spain is often the most cited case due to his extreme deformities and tragic life, few people realize how much the women in the family also suffered. For generations, Habsburg princesses were married off to their cousins or uncles in a web of alliances so tight that they practically became one genetic entity. These women were expected to bear heirs, often many children, in a body that was already ravaged by the effects of shared bloodlines. Infant mortality was rampant. Many were unable to have children at all. Miscarriages and stillbirths were common, and those who survived often suffered from debilitating health conditions. One tragic figure in this lineage was Maria Anna of Austria. Born in 1634, Maria Anna was married to her double first cousin, a man who was genetically nearly her twin. The result? Her children were born weak, and many did not survive infancy. Maria Anna herself suffered from joint issues and severe migraines, common among the Habsburgs, and likely caused by the very same genetic compression that created the infamous Habsburg jaw, a pronounced lower jaw and enlarged tongue that made speaking and chewing difficult. While the jaw is visible in paintings of male monarchs like Charles II, these features and their related difficulties also affected the women. But unlike the kings, whose suffering was recorded in official histories, the pain endured by Habsburg princesses was often hidden, ignored, or dismissed as hysteria. One of the most disturbing aspects of this dynastic inbreeding is how normalized it became. Royal women were raised to believe that their value lay not in their intellect, their kindness, or their ambitions, but in their womb. Their duty was simple yet cruel. Marry a cousin or uncle, produce an heir, and endure the consequences in silence. Take the case of Joanna of Castile, also known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Though many historians debate the true nature of her mental illness, modern scholars have pointed to inbreeding within her ancestry as a contributing factor to her fragile psyche. Joanna exhibited symptoms of paranoia, severe depression, and psychosis. After her husband's death, she was said to have refused to part with his corpse, keeping it with her and believing he would return to life. Though her tale is often told as one of romantic madness, it is also a story of psychological breakdown possibly intensified by genetic vulnerabilities. But inbreeding wasn't confined to Western Europe. Let's travel east, to the glittering but dangerous world of ancient Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, perhaps the most extreme practitioners of royal incest. For centuries, the Ptolemies maintained a rigid custom. The ruling pharaoh must marry his sister. Why? Because they were considered gods on earth, and to share their blood with anyone outside the family would dilute their divine essence. The result was a ruling class that spiraled into madness, paranoia, and instability. And at the heart of this dynasty was perhaps the most iconic queen in history, Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra is often romanticized, intelligent, powerful, a master of diplomacy. But her lineage tells a more disturbing tale. Cleopatra was the product of generations of brother-sister marriages, and she herself married two of her brothers to maintain dynastic tradition. Although she ruled Egypt with skill and charisma, the effects of inbreeding were visible in her family. One of her brothers, Ptolemy XIII, died in his early teens, likely due to health complications. Others in her dynasty suffered from epilepsy, deformities, and mental instability. It's no wonder that the Ptolemaic dynasty collapsed not long after Cleopatra's death. Their genetic pool had become too shallow to sustain a line of healthy rulers. The Ptolemies weren't alone. In medieval and early modern Europe, marrying cousins was almost standard among royal families. The goal was to keep titles, lands, and wealth in the family. But again, it was the women who paid the price. Many were married off in their early teens, often to older relatives, and expected to begin producing heirs immediately. This led to high-risk pregnancies, maternal death, and lifelong trauma. One such tragic figure was Anne of Brittany, twice Queen of France, who endured more than 10 pregnancies in her short life, many ending in miscarriage or stillbirth. While Anne was not as heavily inbred as the Habsburgs or Ptolemies, she married into a system that pushed royal women to the brink, sacrificing their bodies for the continuation of a bloodline. Another haunting example is Margarita Teresa of Spain, a child bride married to her uncle, Leopold I. If you've seen Diego Velázquez's famous painting, Las Meninas, you've seen her, a tiny, fragile girl surrounded by attendants. Margarita Teresa was engaged at just 14, married at 15, and gave birth to 4 children, only one of whom survived infancy. She herself died at just 21. The official cause? Exhaustion from constant childbirth, compounded by congenital deformities that made pregnancy even more dangerous. She was a royal, yes, but she was also a victim of a system that saw her value only in how many heirs she could produce before her body gave out. As we can see, the stories of inbred royal women are not just tales of tragic queens and cursed bloodlines. They're a brutal reminder of what happens when power becomes more important than people, when the health, autonomy, and happiness of women are sacrificed for the illusion of political strength. These women were born into gilded cages, paraded as symbols of royal glory, yet slowly destroyed by the very blood that gave them their status. Their pain was dismissed as hysteria. Fertility issues, chronic pain, immune disorders, all were signs of underlying genetic stress. Yet, instead of addressing the problem, royal advisors doubled down. They married their daughters off younger, hoped for male heirs, and dismissed maternal deaths as unfortunate necessities. The women themselves were rarely given a voice. Their letters were censored. Their medical records were hidden. Their grief was considered weakness. But not all stories end in silence. Some women, even in the face of overwhelming pressure, managed to push back. They refused arranged marriages, rejected cousin unions, or used their influence to modernize their courts. These rebels were few and far between, and their victories often came at great cost: exile, scandal, or estrangement. Yet their defiance marked the beginning of a shift. By the early 20th century, the rise of constitutional monarchies and democratic movements began to erode the power of royal blood. Genetics, once a mysterious force, became a science. And with it came understanding that intermarriage leads not to purity, but to collapse. The story of royal inbreeding isn't just a European tragedy. Across the world, empires relied on marriage alliances to maintain power, and often, that meant turning inward to their own bloodlines. The result? Women across Asia, the Middle East, and even the Americas found themselves trapped in dynasties that valued blood purity over genetic health, tradition over evolution. Let's travel eastward, to the Qing dynasty of China. While the Qing emperors technically avoided close intermarriage among immediate relatives, their concubine system bred its own form of silent suffering. Royal women were plucked from elite Manchu or Han families and confined to the Forbidden City for life. Many were distant cousins or members of a few powerful families that circulated through the imperial court for generations. Though less publicly acknowledged, genetic bottlenecks, limited breeding stock, repeated familial lineages, and strict restrictions on outside marriage still occurred. One tragic result of this insular system was a recurring pattern of infertility, stillbirths, and mental illness among concubines. Women were often blamed for failing to bear sons, but historical records suggest that emperors themselves may have been partially infertile, a possible result of generations of constrained gene pools. These women, trapped by palace rules and tradition, bore the shame of a dynasty's decay. In the Ottoman Empire, a slightly different model unfolded. Rather than marrying royal cousins, Ottoman sultans often chose concubines from foreign lands or enslaved populations. However, once a favored concubine bore a son, she was elevated in rank and her influence grew. Over time, certain concubine bloodlines gained repeated access to the throne. What began as a diverse system slowly narrowed. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Ottoman courts saw the rise of dynastic mothers, women whose daughters or nieces also became concubines, keeping royal favor within the same bloodlines. The case of Safiye Sultan, a powerful royal matriarch, is especially telling. Though she wielded immense power as the mother of Mehmed III, her descendants were often forced into strategic unions within the same extended networks. Eventually, this led to a court filled with men and women who were distantly related by blood, by alliance, or both. While not always as genetically devastating as European inbreeding, the outcome was the same. Weakened dynasties, fertility issues, and a slow erosion of power. Returning to Europe, let's revisit the infamous Habsburg family, this time through the lens of the Spanish line's final monarch, Charles II of Spain. He is often cited as the most inbred king in history, with a coefficient of inbreeding higher than the offspring of sibling parents. Born after more than 200 years of repeated cousin marriages, Charles II suffered from a host of debilitating conditions: severe developmental delays, skeletal deformities, epilepsy, and infertility. But what's often forgotten is how these inherited tragedies rippled outward, especially to the women in his court. Charles's two wives, Marie-Louise d'Orleans and Maria Anna of Neuburg, were both blamed for failing to produce an heir. In reality, Charles was likely infertile due to generations of inbreeding. Yet the blame fell squarely on his wives' shoulders. Marie-Louise was accused of witchcraft, melancholy, and seduction. She died young, possibly from stress-related illness or poisoning. Maria Anna, desperate to maintain her position, involved herself in political intrigue that only hastened the dynasty's collapse. It's crucial to recognize how inbreeding weaponized female fertility as political currency. A queen or consort was only valuable if she produced a healthy male heir. If she didn't, her physical or mental health was scrutinized, her morality questioned, and her status threatened. These women lived in gilded prisons where their worth was determined by biology they couldn't control, and that biology had already been sabotaged by centuries of incestuous tradition. Even in the 20th century, echoes of this genetic arrogance continued. The House of Bourbon-Parma, for example, maintained close cousin marriages well into the 1900s. In one case, a princess married her double first cousin. Their children would have a genetic profile closer to siblings than to normal offspring. While science had already proven the risks of inbreeding, many royal families clung to it, fearing the dilution of noble blood. It was only after World War I and the fall of several monarchies that public pressure began to shift the practice. The trauma of global war and the rise of genetics as a scientific field made inbreeding politically and socially indefensible. Royal families started marrying commoners. Medical screenings became common. Love, not bloodline, began to influence royal unions. The tragic legacy of centuries of suffering women had finally forced a reluctant change. But while the genetic horror show may have ended, its psychological and historical legacy remains. The stories of these women, bent beneath the weight of crowns they didn't choose, fates they couldn't escape, are often erased in favor of tales of kings and generals. Yet they are just as crucial to history. Women like Empress Zita of Austria, who lost everything after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, spent the rest of her life in exile, raising children who bore the legacy of a broken bloodline. Or Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, who suffered delusions that her body contained a glass piano, a documented psychiatric condition now believed to be the result of both genetic and emotional trauma. These are not anecdotes. They are mirrors into dynasties slowly destroyed from within. Even modern pop culture, from Game of Thrones to The Crown, draws on the rich and disturbing history of royal incest, madness, and maternal suffering. But the dramatized versions often miss the most chilling part. It was real. And it wasn't just a few tragic queens or malformed kings. It was a global system that used women as genetic pawns and left their bodies as graves for broken empires. Today, when we look at royal families embracing modernity, interracial marriages, commoner spouses, scientific healthcare, it's easy to forget just how long the journey was and how many women paid for it with their minds, their health, and their lives. Monarchy survives, in part, because its women finally broke free from the brutal cycle of bloodline obsession. As we close this chapter, we must honor not the crown, but the cost. The elegance, wealth, and ceremony of royal life were built on a lie, that purity preserved power. But history, as it always does, revealed the truth. The royal women born into this lie suffered in silence for centuries. Their bodies became symbols of dynastic ambition, and their tragedies, warnings carved into the stone walls of collapsing palaces. But now, as we close this chilling chapter of royal history, one question remains. Was the throne ever worth the suffering it demanded? The twisted legacy of these queens and princesses tells us that behind every crown was a cost, and behind every dynasty, a hidden tragedy. If this story gripped you, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Past Uncovered, where we bring you the disturbing truths, forgotten royals, and secrets history tried to bury. Hit the like button if you want more twisted tales of royalty, and tap the notification bell, because our next video might just reveal a secret you were never meant to know. Tell us in the comments, which royal figure shocked you the most? And would you survive in a world where your bloodline mattered more than your life? This was Dark Past Uncovered. Until next time, keep questioning the past, because the past was never really pure.